Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar, and I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center here at Michigan State, for those who don't know me. And Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series. We're very, very delighted today to have Dr. Kirwin as our guest speaker. And before I pass it to him, a brief introduction. He's a division chief in the Office of Opinion Research at the U.S. Department of State and a professorial lecturer at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He has a PhD in political science from Michigan State University, so welcome back. And Bachelors in International Studies from the Ohio State University. His research has been supported by a Fulbright-Hays doctoral dissertation research grant and a West African Research Association Pre-Dissertation grant. He served in the Peace Corps in Niger and is fluent in Hausa and French. And Matt's talk is titled Terrorism and Colonial Legacies in the Sahel, Social Media, Conspiracies, and the Decline of French Influence. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you.
Thanks, Awa. So I work for the State Department. The disclaimer always is what I'm talking about doesn't represent the views of the USG. It's more, research I've done. So it's more about my personal take on things. So just, talking about this topic in the Sahel, and I did my dissertation here on conflict between farmers and herders in Burkina Faso, kind of a niche subject at the time, and wasn't too much focus on the Sahel. But now the Sahel it's a major policymaker issue at the State Department, Department of Defense, for the French, obviously, and for all those citizens living in the Sahel that face this extremist violence. So I think there's a lot of attention on the topic. Working for the State Department, I get to do some trips once in a while, and I was out in Niger in 2019, late 2019, and I had done the Peace Corps in Niger. Feel really well at ease in Niger, walking around the streets, speaking Hausa or a little bit of Zarma that I have. And I remember walking around Niamey, going back to my hotel, and these Nigerians come up to me and they say, "You need to go back to where you're from. You need to go to your French embassy. You better go hide there right now." And I was really shocked to have somebody come up to me and kind of accost me like that. And I responded in Hausa and talked to them and said, "I'm not French, I'm American. I lived in Zinder for 3 years." And they said, "Okay, that's fine." But it was just kind of remarkable how, seeing somebody of European descent on the streets could provoke somebody to have that kind of visceral reaction. So it made me kind of wonder, what are the dynamics, what's changing in Niger right now where people have those kinds of opinions. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about the rise of some of the extremism in the Sahel. Also, what are the roots, what are the foundations of people's changing perceptions of the French and Western influence? And how has that been affected by the proliferation of social media usage in the region? So I have a couple pictures here. I'm sure everybody knows Lumumba, Sankara. Does anybody know who these people are? Before Boigny, right? And the gentleman next to him, Jacques Foccart. He was known as Monsieur Afrique for the French government. The joke was that anytime he would go to a West African or African capital, there would be a coup d'etat like a week later. So he was the one who was kind of setting, he was the Élysées man for Africa, making sure that the system that I'm going to talk about, France-Afrique, kind of stayed in permanence. And then here's just a couple memes that you'll see circulating on social media. One of them here showing gold bars covered with the tricolor. And there you have French troops in the maybe Sahara Desert digging a hole, and they're extracting gold. So the suggestion is that the French are pillaging resources in the Sahel. And here you have another one where this French military member is accused of being a terrorist. So these are circulating in the Sahel. People are buying into them. So I want to talk a little bit about, how did that happen? Okay. So when we talk about the Cold War in Africa and much of the global South, right? After independence, there was a lot of pressure on governments to kind of go on either side of this debate. Some countries allied with the West, others with the more Marxist ideology, and in some places it resulted in violent conflict between groups and proxy wars between the West and the Eastern Bloc or Soviet-backed countries. Now, one thing to consider, as we're talking about this proxy Cold War that's happening in Africa is, the role of the West in the removal of Patrice Lumumba from power. Right. And I think there was a recent book that came out that talks about this. And Lumumba was elected prime minister of newly independent Congo in 1960. And then just a year later, he's arrested and killed in early 1961. And, we know the role that the West played in this, right? Several different countries, the US, Belgium, in capturing Lumumba and then his eventual demise. And, when you think about Lumumba, right, he was a real icon for Africa, somebody who spoke out for independence. And to see somebody like this killed right when a lot of countries are getting independence, it had a negative impact on how Africans viewed the West and their place in international affairs. So moving on, just a couple of years, looking at the Cold War and how people started to, especially some musicians, started to see like their place in the Cold War, right? And it wasn't just happening in Africa; there was happening in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Bob Marley, who just a biopic came out about him. He started singing about this, right? So it kind of entered into the popular culture. This great song, "Ambush in the Night," on the album Survival in 1979, has these lyrics. So they're bribing us with their guns, spare parts, and money, trying to belittle our integrity. And we're so ignorant because every time they can reach us. So what he's alluding to are these outside factors, maybe the Soviets, maybe the West, who are coming in and pushing this violence, right, in Jamaica between the two political parties. And there's a great novel written about this. It's called A Brief History of Seven Killings. And it really does a great job talking about this violence that's happening in Jamaica and who's kind of behind the violence. So think about Bob Marley, who, it's a dated term, but they called him the first third world superstar, right? This is somebody who sang these lyrics and it spread all over the world. And, Marley is very popular in Africa. So it's starting to go into the popular conscience a little bit that there's these different powers at play that are behind the violence that's happening. So when we talk about, I'm focusing on the Sahel. So just to talk a little bit of the system of France-Afrique, it's described as a system in which French political and business leaders maintain a close relationship with African elites to maintain financial and security interests. All right, so one aspect of this is the CFA monetary system that's still in place. And then critics of this system viewed African leaders as vassals of Paris. And some of the leaders that were more closely aligned with the French were Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire and Omar Bongo in Gabon. We're talking about this system of France-Afrique. Then you have this leader, Thomas Sankara, came to power in 1983. He's the leader of one of the poorest countries in the world, Volta. But he calls for Burkina Faso to seek their own solutions for development, really rejecting the system of France-Afrique, heavily criticized Francois Mitterrand for his role in supporting apartheid South Africa, very, very transient remarks regarding France and their support for South Africa, constantly railing against imperialism, push for a stronger national identity, and the circumstances around his death in 1987 are still not clear. But Sankara, right, created a lot of pride in Burkina Faso, And if you look just in the Sahel right now or in West Africa, people are looking at Sankara still as this kind of mythic figure, as somebody who stood up against the system of France-Afrique.
Sankara. He was a very patient person. But that's understandable because when you live in the kind of impoverishment, the kind of hunger that our people are living in, you cannot afford to be patient because people can't drink good water, people are hungry, etc. So you have every justification to be patient.
In 1983, with Sankara just recently in power, the Vitel Conference in France calls for a meeting between President François Mitterrand and other African heads of state, most of which had gone through the decolonization process at the beginning of the 60s. Some feel threatened by their own people, who are starting to support the ideas of the revolution in Burkina Faso, like Félix Houphouët-Boigny, president of the Ivory Coast and a puppet of France. Most of the heads of state present in Vitel have been in power for years and retained their allegiance to the former colonial power.
La politique africaine de la France l'a souvent très française.
C'est-à-dire,
Ça veut dire qu'elle ressemble aux autres politiques françaises. Hier, la France était dans tel ou tel pays d'Afrique pour soit maintenir un chef, un dirigeant à la télé, soit pour débarquer d'une caravelle, un autre que l'on emportait, soit aujourd'hui encore la France possède des signes.
For Sankara, Vitel is an opportunity to challenge this allegiance, which for him is a remnant of colonial practices.
Vitel servait, pour utiliser un langage imagé, à réunir autour du roi ses ministres et ses vassaux. Vitel, c'était un peu cela. Rappeler aux chefs d'État africains qu'ils évoluent dans une ère politique donnée qui avait ses lois. Il y avait aussi les fameux réseaux focaux, réseaux ceci, réseaux cela, les sous-réseaux, les réseaux. Et bon, on pouvait faire les défaits les chefs d'État, on pouvait provoquer des grèves qui conduisaient à leur chute dès lors que les budgets des États africains sont alimentés parfois à 50-60% par l'ancienne métropole. Donc, c'est une situation de vassalité réelle sur le plan financier, autant que sur le plan économique.
Je crois vous connaître tous, ou à peu près. Je sais où se dirige votre idéal, quels sont vos choix idéologiques, quelles sont vos amitiés, vos alliances. Et vous avez bien le droit d'avoir une conception différente du monde. Mais moi, je vous dis, en n'engageant que moi, que je pense qu'il ne serait pas bon que tout conflit ou toute difficulté sur la surface de la planète devienne un élément supplémentaire d'une crise Est-Ouest.
But the disintegration, the balkanization of the continent created a very complex situation for us. We found ourselves in a crossfire between the East and the West. You know, in a very complex situation that made it very difficult for us to be Africans. You know, your survival depended on alignment with the East or the West and things like that, but not on your Africanness.
Julien Gatier, je vais en avoir trois. Ma question s'adresse au capitaine Sankara. Je veux savoir qu'est-ce que vous avez été chercher à Moscou et à Cuba dernièrement, parce que vos voyages posent aussi question à la France, mais aux pays voisins comme la Côte d'Ivoire.
Bon, j'étais à Moscou, j'étais à Cuba, et ailleurs aussi. Je ne sais pas seulement été dans ces pays-là, parce que nous entretenons d'excellentes relations avec ces pays, avec les dirigeants de ces pays. Nous avons des projets qui nous paraissent extrêmement importants pour notre développement. Nous recherchons des partenaires. Si un pays plus proche peut nous éviter un long déplacement jusqu'à Moscou, nous n'aurons absolument aucun inconvénient. Personne n'a pas l'idée que j'ai refusé. Je ne crois pas. Il me manque seulement un concorde, parce que
So there you have just a little bit of discussion about Sankara and his take on the France-Afrique situation and how, that really raised his profile that among Burkinabe, but also Africans around the continent about that system that was in place. I mentioned Bob Marley and his music. Now moving forward a few decades, you have some Ivoirian musicians who are singing songs that kind of touch on those same kind of topics. And you have this song here, On a tout compris. And it's a little bit more than just we understand everything. It's more, I'd say, a more apt translation would be we know what's going on. So what he's saying here is they light the fire, they activate it after they come to play firefighter. Pyromane pompier in French. So he's alluding to the fact that there's these outside forces that are coming to kind of light things up in Africa, and then they come and say they're putting out the fire. Interesting quote, 1996, but then applying it to what's happening in the Sahel, and especially the French presence. You also have this other reggae singer from Cote d'Ivoire, Alpha Blondy. This is 1998. He comes out with this song called Armée Française, and he's calling for the French military to leave, right? Because at this point, 1998, you still have a lot of French bases on the continent, in Abidjan, in Dakar, Gabon, and N'Djamena. So he's saying all these things like the negative aspects of a French military presence. And this is well before what's happening in after 2012 with the presence of the French for the Barkhane mission. Now we're fast forwarding it a few years, and just the explosion of violence in the Sahel, right? I remember when I wanted to do my dissertation research on Burkina Faso. I wanted to look at why Burkina is a peaceful country. Of course, in political science, you don't select cases on the dependent variable. So I switched my topic to look at conflict between farmers and herders. But Burkina was this bastion of peace, right? There was no violence going on here. Everybody was looking at the Sahel and saying, why is Burkina so peaceful? Now, Burkina has a tremendous amount of attacks going on every year. And this is just through 2020, right? There's been this explosion of violence, right? To even, if you look at Burkina Faso, like the government only controls maybe 40% of the territory. Niger, right? Just kind of this narrow band here, but they can't project too much power there. In Mali, same kind of story. So how are people in the Sahel understanding this, right? There's always been rebellions in the Sahel, Tuareg rebellions, Tubu rebellions, but there's never been violence on this scale. Here you go, 2021, really skyrocketing Burkina Faso. So how are people interpreting this? How can they explain it? Talking heads have a great quote, facts are useless in emergencies. So this is an emergency that's happening in the Sahel, and people are trying to understand it. Right around that same time, I went to Niamey, and some folks told me I should leave because I'm French. Salif Keita, incredible Malian singer of great influence, comes out with this quote. Are you still not aware that it is France which is financing our enemies against our children? There's no terrorist in Mali. All that is going on is orchestrated by France. If you're afraid to speak the truth to France, if you cannot manage this country, step down another person who's not afraid to take over. Why do you waste your time submitting yourself to this little Emmanuel Macron? He's just a child. So you have this very influential musician beyond Mali, into Burkina, Niger, all of West Africa, basically, coming out with this statement, very strident statement against the French, saying that they're actually the ones behind the terrorism. Backdrop to this is the growth of social media in the Sahel. So over time, going back to 2017, in these three countries, you only have about 10% or lower of the population using WhatsApp. How many people here use WhatsApp? And if you focus on Africa, it's especially a great tool to stay in touch with people and to join group chats and exchange information and photographs and things like that. So it's really growing on the continent. In Mali, for example, in 2022, over 40% are using it on a daily or a weekly basis. And, if you're in some of these chats, the way that, all the memes and images are shared and forwarded, all that content, it's very influential. And I think the fact that it's kind of a group that you're in, not necessarily like Facebook, but it's like a more contained group, maybe it gives even more credence to the messages that are exchanged. You also have significant growth in Burkina Faso, Niger as well. It's a little bit of an anomaly, but I think it's within the margin of error, that drop that happened there. And at the same time, you start seeing these images that are circulating on WhatsApp that are being shared. So this was actually a terrorist attack on a resort just outside Bamako, where some French military folks had to be exfiltrated. But the way that the disinformation circulated was that they were the actual terrorists and they got arrested by Malian forces. There was a fact check by AFP and they found it to be fake. Then you have another image like this. The enemies of peace in Mali are France, Barkhane, which is a military mission, MINUSMA, which was the UN mission there. Those are the enemies, and it's the guerre par procuration of France in Mali. Stop the French genocide in Mali. Right, so you're starting to see these kinds of images circulate, and at the same time, the WhatsApp usage is significantly higher in the capital areas, right? Just because of probably better data access, maybe 4G networks, more expendable income where people can pay for the data, or maybe Wi-Fi spots where they can access it. But you can just see how some really stark differences in terms of WhatsApp usage. And the other thing about that is, in the capitals, that's where protests and manifestations are going to happen. So this is something really important to keep an eye on as well. Over time, right? So this is tracking views of France over time in Burkina Faso, Mali. So it had kind of been in the 50s over time. These are nationwide surveys. But then we have the Arab Spring that happens. You have the fall of Gaddafi in Libya. That creates massive problems for the Sahel. You have people who had worked in Libya having to return to their countries. You also have some fighters, some mercenaries for Gaddafi that are returning to their countries in Mali and Niger. And that creates this Tuareg rebellion in like 2011. And then it gets co-opted by extremists. And then the French intervene. And that's why you have this huge spike in positive views of the French, right? In like 2013, it jumps up to like 80%. And supposedly, this is during Francois Hollande's administration. People in Mali were naming their kids Francois, supposedly, because they were so happy to see the French there. But as we know, any military occupation over time, any military presence over time, if you look at the US and Iraq or Afghanistan, right, positive opinions of those kinds of presences drops over time. And you could just see how it's really fallen over time. So part of it is just that military presence, but I think the social media usage plays a role in that as well. And then we also ask people which country creates the most problems for your country. And that sentiment is even higher in these capitals, right? Niamey, it's through the roof compared to rural areas. Here you see another image being circulated, stop French genocide in Mali. And this had to do with, there was some interethnic massacres that happened in central Mali between the Dogon and the Fulani. And they were blaming the French for those. Here you have an insecticide can painted in the colors of the flag of Mali with the Mali map on it, killing a cockroach painted in the French flag's colors. The other one that's really took off was the story that the French were supporting the extremist groups. And here you have the French delivery of all these motorcycles that were donated to, I think, gendarmes. But in this, they're saying this because a lot of the terrorists in the Sahel, they circulate on motorcycles. they're saying if the French are offloading these motorcycles to support or donate them to the extremist groups so that they could further destabilize Mali. Here you have some other pictures. This is happening in 2019. It goes along with the audio message claiming that the Malians are actually there. The French are actually in Mali because they want to extract gold. And here you have actually a reference to that one song I mentioned earlier. We know what's going on. France doesn't help Africa, but it destroys Africa and steals its riches. And then they're actually pointing out a couple French corporations. No to France Afrique, no to the CFA, no to Total, which is the oil company, and Bolloré, which is a logistical company that does work in Africa, a French company. Here you have another photo claiming that all these arms were seized in Burkina Faso on their way to Kidal, which is in northern Mali. So you have all this evidence, right? Purported evidence that's circulating on WhatsApp suggesting that the French are behind the violence. And now you even have some of the extremist groups kind of piling on some of these conspiracy theories. So JNIM is one of the biggest extremist groups that's operating in that region. And if you look at some of the key points in there, they're saying that what the French do there is actually a slavery system that supports France Afrique and the CFA. That tweet also talks about Macron mobilizing his proxies in the region to convene a meeting. They explain that the massacres against the Fulani in the region are because of the French. So the French are catching it not only from people in the Sahel, but also from some extremists operating there. Now we fast forward to what's happened in Niger, and we still have these memes that are circulating, but they're really rooted in historical narratives, right? So everybody know the tirailleurs Senegalais, right? The tirailleurs Senegalais were not just Senegalais, they were from other parts of West Africa, but they were recruited by the French to fight in World War I, fight in World War II. They wore these kind of woolen jackets like this and wore these kinds of hats. And, you know, we know the history with the French recruiting them, not giving them their due, using them to colonize the rest of West Africa. And then when the French were liberated, when France was liberated after World War II, right, they didn't get any kind of credit. So it's the same kind of thing. They're saying these different African presidents are just the newest version of the tirailleurs Senegalais. And they're basically, these are all the ECOWAS folks who wanted to intervene in Niger. So you have Ouattara from Cote d'Ivoire, Tinubu, Nigeria, Bazoum in Niger, Macky Sall, Patrice Talon, and I think that's the president of Guinea-Bissau. And then you have a play on words for, instead of patron, it's patron. Macron. So he's actually the head of the CEDEAO. It's Macron, not these people, not these presidents. They're actually just doing his bidding. And then over here, you have Macron kind of outfitted as a Napoleon Bonaparte character, being carried by his French, what you call them, but they're carrying him around much the same way that maybe a French explorer or somebody during the exploration of France would be carried, exploration of Africa would be carried around, and he's telling them to attack Niger. So you have Ouattara, Sall, and Tinubu once again. And this is really framing what's happening in Niger, right? So these kinds of images. And then when I was just in Chad back in November, I saw this car making its rounds in Jamena. It says Wagner, Putin, Afrique. So I think, you know, one thing to consider, right, this is having a really detrimental effect on the reputation of the French, but at the same time, like there's this kernel of truth, right? When looking back at the France-Afrique system, how the French colonized France, Africa, how they continued to play what some Africans would say a meddlesome role in the region. I think what would be really important to focus on moving forward has to do with some of the conspiracies around public health. Not too long ago, the Americans were accused of spreading dengue fever in Burkina Faso by some of our adversaries. COVID-19 have some of the same issues. There were some comments by French scientists who said that, you know, Africa is actually a great place to explore how we can find a cure for COVID. What's this going to look like when there's increased internet penetration, right? So right now in some of these countries, it's like 30 to 40%. What's the disinformation going to look like when it reaches 80%? And I think, you know, there's probably parallels that can be drawn with the United States, right? We're not immune to disinformation, right? It's affected our elections and other political aspects of our lives here. And then the relationship between social media usage and perceptions of foreign actors. So when we zoom in on people who use WhatsApp more frequently, we see that their perceptions of the French are a lot lower. So people are really, you know, they're consuming this media and it's having a really negative effect on French reputation. By the same token, it's actually elevated favorability towards the Russians. Because, you know, some of the aspects that the Russians are talking about, and, you know, that video that Sankara was, when Sankara was talking, you know, it reminds you so much of what's going on in the Sahel right now, especially with the president of Burkina Faso, who uses a lot of the same language, right? Saying that we want people who will give us weapons to fight terrorists. So the reputation of Russia has increased, and Russia has also been very adept at using what they call kind of African values, that they want to protect African values more than the West does. And some of that has to do with like anti-LGBTQ, right, that the Russians promote in Russia, but also in Africa. So I think that's going to be a key point looking in the future is how is Russia's reputation going to be enhanced because of all this disinformation that's circulating. So that's what I've got for you. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Very much. So with that, please the room, if you have questions, you can go ahead and ask, and then we'll go to people online.
So can I just ask you where you just ended? So what is the evidence? So what is the evidence or indications when it comes to Russia's maybe more direct involvement in the spread of disinformation, which we know is a strategy that employed widely across the globe? And I would imagine this would be a right kind of context for those kind of disinformation.
So what's the evidence that they're directly involved?
Yes.
Yeah, so
do we have an indication of to what extent you are actually directly with these players?
yeah, so some of it has to do with videos that you can tell are produced by the Russians. Like, I don't know if you've seen the one in Central African Republic, where there's a cartoon of a bear wrestling with a lion and how the bear comes and saves the day. And then there's another one where you have Wagner troops that are killing these zombies that are dressed like the French. So those are like very explicit ones where I think we can safely assume that it's the Russians behind that. But then you also have to think about African influencers that might be getting some funding from nefarious actors to amplify their messages, right? Because it might look better if you have somebody on the continent who's African pushing those messages. And I'm thinking specifically of maybe Nathalie Yam, who's a Cameroonian French activist. And part of the difficult thing with all this is they're being framed as Pan-Africanists. And to me, like, Pan-Africanism isn't a dirty word, but now some of these people who are promoting this disinformation for the benefit of Russia, they're being identified as Pan-Africanists. So it's difficult to say, especially from what I see at work, that I can't discuss too much in a forum like this, like who's doing what. But there's definitely stuff that's done by Russia, and then there's other stuff where I think they're supporting local actors to disseminate their messages. Carolyn?
But I sort of had the same question and just want to sort of follow on that. I mean, the suggestion would be there's not sort of any non-externally supported grassroots element generating this. Is that what?
There is there is.
Just generated by the Russians directly or with their support individuals, but I just wonder sort of.
I think that no, there is grassroots efforts as well, and you know it's so easy to make an image like this, right? So this one here, don't know who made that, right? That could very easily be done by someone at the grassroots level. That doesn't necessarily have to be connected with the nefarious actor. So it's hard to really distinguish who's doing what. Peter.
I'm interested in your use of WhatsApp, but also for reasons you explained. Also, I'm thinking of platforms and how each platform influences this process you're outlining in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So like in WhatsApp, there is a kind of grassroots element in it because it's real people. You decide who's in the chat, who's not. They're usually moderators who set the rules, admins. You can get kicked out if you don't follow a certain line. So it has that kind of authenticity that the genuineness that something like Facebook, perhaps, which so much of the activity is determined by the algorithm, by commercial factors, doesn't have. So I was wondering about the other platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And you looked at those, how do they differ, and how maybe more susceptible to disinformation are those? Are they more effective in providing disinformation? What's your take on that? If you have insights on that, would be great.
Yeah, so I agree 100% on WhatsApp and how you have kind of this small group where it could be friends and family. You know, it can even be 100 people, 200 people, right? But you feel like it's kind of a closed conversation where you don't have other people joining it. And the interesting thing with WhatsApp is too, you can also share so many links in there, right? And so you can have the chat that's going on, but then you can link it to a Facebook page. You can link it to something on Instagram, something on TikTok. But the WhatsApp, I think it's kind of like a closed conversation, which gives people more confidence in what's being shared. And then also like people go to Facebook, they'll take a screenshot, they can share that in WhatsApp. So I think even though it's WhatsApp, it's also linked to a lot of different social media accounts.
I just came here because I thought this was an interesting topic, but I see this as like a pretty big problem. You know, it can cause, like, the disinformation can cause extra hate in the world between different countries and different people, which leads to further problems. Do you think that there's any type of solution that we can use against this misinformation? Because I feel like if foreign aid were to come in and try to provide aid, you know, to stop the spread of misinformation, it would lead to even further problems. So is there even a solution that's possible to like solve this? I guess how.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem, right? Isn't there an expression like a lie goes around the world before like the truth's put in its pants on or something like that? Yeah, so like this right here, right? It was fact checked by AFP, which is a French Agence France Presse. But is anybody going to believe that the French, this news organization, is actually like debunking something? They're probably going to think, oh, of course they're French. Of course they're going to say that this isn't true. So they're not going to buy into it. I think there has been some growth in like fact check organizations in Africa who try and debunk some of these stories, but you know they're getting circulated in those WhatsApp groups, so it's kind of closed off. You can't really have any insight into how that's working. At least like a Facebook page, you can see that. Maybe Facebook can shut it down or something. But those internal conversations, it's harder to intervene. And then if you know, for some Africans, and Jeff, I know you do a lot of work on media. But so feel free to jump in. But I think some people believe that this is actually democratizing the continent, right? Like the fact that there's so many different sources that are available now that aren't owned by a media conglomerate or some rich politician in a country or owned by the government, that people kind of value this diversity of opinions.
Can I ask like a follow-up question to that and then kind of a related question? One is, yeah, there's a lot of evidence that fact checking just does not work. And one of the reasons why it doesn't work is because people share this stuff, even when sometimes they know it's fake, but they like the message behind it already, right? And so the question then is like a chicken and egg, and you're a trained social scientist, right? Like, do we know that the disinformation is causing like the negative attitudes about France, or are people sharing the negative stuff about France because they already don't like France for all the other reasons that you talked about, right? And then my second question is, we focus a lot on the Russian disinformation, but there's got to be anti-Russian disinformation out there, right? I mean, the Russians are doing, Wagner is doing terrible things in places like Mali and Kar, right? And sharing the truth about that should be effective in turning popular opinion against it. But are we? I shouldn't say we. Are folks spreading anti-Russian disinformation too that we're picking up on? It's not one-sided, right?
Right. No, I'm sure that there's programs out there, yeah, that are trying to counter this or denigrate their reputation as well. Yeah. So that's a good point about have people already found they already have this very strong opinion that the French are bad, and now in that WhatsApp group, are they just sending more confirmations of that? Of images like this, like, yeah, they are terrible, and look at this, what they did, and look at that. So I think that's a good one. Tough social science question to actually see the causal relationship. That's tricky. But the other thing, we probably should do some models to look at all these different factors we have, and what is the factor that is having that biggest impact on perceptions of the French or the Russians. And some we haven't looked at, but some people could also say that it's not necessarily the social media, that's a proxy for age, right? It could be just younger people are more dismissive of the French, and maybe it doesn't really have anything to do with social media. So I think that requires some more investigation. Or it could be people who are on social media have more of an expendable income or higher levels of education, so maybe they're more critical of the French presence than somebody with a lower level of education.
Thank you for your talk. How do
I can hardly hear what you, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Oh. We'll let her get her question in, and then there's somebody from the audience? Yeah. Online audience?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So is it under a certain agenda? Like, is it a piece of a certain agenda or the government or like a movement that is with so how do people understand these violent events?
So the violence, I think it all, there's multiple factors that drive this extremism and the violence, right? So some of it has to do with marginalized populations in these different pockets of the Sahel who feel like they've never really gotten anything from the government. So they start insurgent movements to maybe get those questions addressed. Another aspect of it could be the fact that there's a lot of criminal networks that operate in the Sahara and the Sahel that are responsible for trafficking drugs and contraband through there, and some of those groups have recruited other people to join them. Some of it has to do with like the predatory nature of some of the security forces in the Sahel, right? They've seen that their armies, their security forces have preyed on citizens, haven't really delivered anything, haven't delivered security. And one of those key questions is, when you see somebody from your military coming towards you and you're fleeing a conflict, do you run towards your military or do you run away from it? And in the Sahel, right, some people just don't feel that their military is delivered in that regard. And then justice as well. I think that's another key issue. You don't have strong institutions that are meting out justice in some of these very remote areas, right? So conflict between farmers and herders, if there's no judge that's going to decide on who is wrong when herders' animals eat the farmer's food, then they're going to look for another way to address that injustice. And maybe they'll join an extremist group, or they'll get a gun from an extremist and then try and get their own revenge. So that there's all sorts of factors that play into the rise of extremism, and then just lack of opportunities, right? Maybe you're better off joining an extremist group than going to school or something like that, because there's limited opportunities once you do graduate. I think it's really complicated to try and identify just one factor that explains the rise of the violence in the Sahel. And then, if you're somebody from the Sahel and you've lived peacefully for decades, and now you have this explosion, like, how do you explain it? And I think, part of that is why people are blaming France for it. They think that France is behind it, and they've seen how the West has acted over time, in some cases that haven't been supportive of democracy or development in the Sahel.
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Kirwin, thank you very much indeed. I think the overview you've given is convincing, and it demands a whole number of questions. I'm a South African sociologist in South Africa who has got a reasonable French. I've had 5 or 6 doctoral students from Francophone Africa, spent some time in Bamako and in Dakar, but I know more about the equatorial Francophone countries and others. My question is not about what the changing views are vis-a-vis the French government and the French history of colonization. My question is about the French language. And I'd like to simply give you 2 examples on that. I had a doctoral student from Gabon who studied the Francophone migrants who had left Francophone African countries, many of them, and came down to Cape Town in South Africa. And he found that they had formed for themselves here in Cape Town a new identity, and that was sharing their Francophone background, and it became important to them. That's one example. The other example is 5 of the 6 doctoral students who came to the university that I'm at in South Africa have written their theses in French, their doctoral theses in French, and they are very pleased about that because they've said they are then able to take their theses back to their Francophone countries and share these theses with the different universities in other Francophone African countries. So given that, my question is, have you looked at all at the continuing importance of the institution of the French language rather than the former colonial institutions and the new ones? And what sort of short to medium term future do you think there is with regard to the fact that maybe not right up in North Africa, which is increasingly become more Arabophone than Francophone, but in both the Sahel and in Francophone Central Africa, French appears to me, in my experience, and from these 2 examples, to be deeply rooted as an institution of exchange. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question. I think that if people want to get into Francophone Africa, they want to get out in our country. I guess it's the lessons of their research, the dissertation in French, but I think it's starting to change. I think there's a lot of people who prefer to do their research or their grad school in the US or other places. I think it's opening up as well to other places like China, where you can go there and do a master's degree. Awa, you're actually probably better situated to answer this question than I am. You know, having gone to school in a francophone system, the marketability of the degree from a francophone institution rather than one from another institution. I don't have too much insight into that.
Yeah. Yes, my name is Leo Zulu. I'm an African Studies Center here. Maybe I can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah.
So we've been having delegations recently from West African universities that come to build collaborations. And one of the big requests they ask of us is language writing for their faculty in English. The sentiment is that they are isolated in terms of their scholarship, and the reach into the Anglophone world has limited their upward mobility and ability to access different audiences, expertise, and to share their knowledge. So, I mean, just over the last two, maybe semesters, that we've had 3 delegations like that, and we're kind of trying to find ways we can link them to our writing center here at MSU to help their faculty writing English language. Just, I don't know if that helps. But.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think, I remember when I was in grad school at Michigan State, I got to take part in this American Political Science Association workshop in Senegal, and it was led by Leonard Wanchikon and Catherine Boone. And Leonard Wanchikon's whole thing was like, we need to teach people in Africa real political science methods, not like French style, I guess. And his thing was, you know, it has to be very quantitative. So I could see how, you know, maybe that could be attractive to some folks to on the continent having like a different methodological approach to a discipline like political science. You know, not always just kind of like the French tradition, but another tradition of scholarship.
So and Leonard's a big proponent, not just of English style political science, but of teaching English in his African school.
Scott.
Mali has French is no longer the official language. It's another one they have 12.
But it's the
Now they have about 12 different local languages sharing the status. My question was about media. One thing that struck me about Niger, and it's just pure, so, is that RFE, radio friends of attention, that's what everybody listens to. Everybody who's educated francophone. And they trust it much more than, you know, watches
Or RTN.
local.
Scott,
Local news.
people in the back can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. So I'm wondering if there's evidence and anybody collects data, if people stop listening to RFE and instead are just, you know, sharing news through social media. Because obviously they're going to get a very different take from RFE on politics in the Sahel and everywhere than if they're against the sources.
Yeah, well, I think RFE's been banned in some countries. Like, I think it's been banned in Burkina Faso. Right, but yeah, like France 24 was another one that people put a lot of faith in, the TV station.
Right.
But I think that's dropped off. And the other thing is, like, if it's a RFE program in Niger, who can really listen to it? If it's not somebody who's, you know, conversant in French, right? So I think in terms of like radio stations, a lot of people listen to BBC Hausa, very popular. Voice of America also has programs in Hausa. Deutsche Welle as well. So I think programs that are done in local languages are usually the most popular. And I think as these conspiracy theories have grown about France, I think the reputation of French news outlets has fallen over time as well.
So I will unmute. Mercy.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. The connection is not always very great. Fantastic presentation. My name is Mercy. I am with the United Nations, and I'm part of a group of UN communications professionals that have been looking at the spread of disinformation across what we are calling the belt of instability. And so I'm just wondering whether you had a chance to look at the usage of Telegram, because that has been a major, a sort of preferred mode of communicating or just spreading misinformation, disinformation across the entire region from CAR, Burkina Faso, Niger, and so on. That's my question, and thank you very much.
Yeah, so our battery for media usage, we ask about Instagram, Twitter, WhatsApp, Facebook, and Snapchat. We haven't asked about Telegram, but we're going to add that to surveys going forward.
What really matters is football. Have the attitudes of people changed towards the French national team, which used to have this brand of being multicultural, and in Trevor Noah's estimation, actual African identity? Not the trouble for saying that Africa won the World Cup in 2018, not France. Has there been a change, a noticeable change? Football does matter, and it's often tied to these political imaginations, if not realities. Too early to tell.
Yeah, I think the reputation of Le Bleu has fallen, even though the composition of the team is mostly of African descent and Arab descent. But yeah, I don't think you'd see as many people wearing French jerseys as you have in the past. That's just anecdotal evidence. But then just looking at the most recent Cup of Nations, there were some political implications of some of those games, right? Where you had Burkina Faso playing Mali, which some people said was like the Alliance of Sahelian States Cup. So you had those two countries who are leaving ECOWAS and playing each other. And then when you had Mali playing Cote d'Ivoire, right, that was another major one where those two countries haven't gotten along very well. At one point, Mali arrested all these Ivorian peacekeepers and had them in jail for a while. And then Ouattara and Goita haven't always gotten along that well. So I think there's maybe more in the Cup of Nations. We saw some of that playing out. Like the pro-ECOWAS component versus the AES component.
So Blinken was at the match that Ivory Coast got whooped in by Equatorial Guinea. And once he left, the fortunes of Cote d'Ivoire lost. I wonder if people have talked about that on the side.
Right.
Once the Americans were out of the
picture. I think I was talking to some a colleague who works in the embassy in Cote d'Ivoire a couple of weeks ago. And he was just saying how thankful he was that the Cote d'Ivoire ended up winning the whole thing. Otherwise, it didn't look so great. 4-0 to Equatorial Guinea, right?
So my question is to go back to what Jeff was saying. What comes first is the chicken or the egg, and also to your question, what can be done? And it showed also in one of your images the criticism around the French CEPA. So we talk about disinformation, but existing seems to be something that's really crystallizing people's attention. Why is French not? Why does French want to hold on to the French CEPA? So is that disinformation? What people are saying about French CEPA holding on? that's the one that's feeding the French and literally taking their money. So what role does it play in this whole disinformation? The role that the real role, not the fake stuff, but the real things that France is doing. Can France do something? Like, why can't you just say, okay, you want to, like De Gaulle did in 1958, you want your independence, take it. But now, isn't that, is France holding on to this money, this African money, and having it in it's a bank, using it instead of the Africans having. So many countries have their own currency. Why is it it's only the former French colonizers that cannot have their money? And the role that Ivory Coast has been playing, making sure that the echo becomes something else. I'm just, what's the link? Like the real need, why people are having this, what comes first?
Yeah, well, I think it's, some people would say it's like the most symbolic vestige of colonialism on the continent, the CFA. That's what some people would say. And I think a Senegalese filmmaker just came out with a movie about the CFA. Seen it, you see it's playing in DC. There's an African film festival. See it. I think it's playing this weekend. But yeah, I think if anything, it continues to hurt their reputation. I've seen another meme that circulates that has it's got Mali and France, and then 2 columns, and then one says number of gold mines, and 0 for France, and then 60 for Mali, and then there's another column, gold reserves, and it's got like X number of tons for France, 0 for Mali, right? So that's kind of alluding to maybe the CFA as well, like some kind of gold reserves that are attached to it. So I think if anything, it just allows people who don't like France to have more ammunition to criticize them.
But is it who don't like France? Why is it that they don't like France? It's not out of nowhere that they don't like France. That's my question. Like the dislike has a basis. And it's really linked to this money thing, I think, at least. So if France wants to change its image, it's not like the people just woke up one day and say, oh, we decided we're not going to like the French anymore after liking it. There is information of what, for me, what's new is people maybe did not know what was happening with the France CFA. And then with social media now explaining, oh, this is really what's happening.
Right.
The French are taking out, and that's when you start seeing all this dislike. So my point is, it's not out of nowhere that these people don't like France from. We have to dig deeper. Why is it really like? Why is it that people suddenly just don't like it? Where is this dislike?
Yeah, well, I think that's also what I wanted to try to point to in this presentation, right? Some of those like kernels of animosity, like some of it having to do with what's going on with ECOWAS and what's going on with Niger. Also, like the France-Afrique system, of which the CFA is a part of it. So I think there's multiple aspects to it. The CFA one is probably the most visible out of all of those.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was not, yeah,
No problem. Jeff?
That's a really good, that's like kind of the core question.
Yeah.
But I also wonder like how much this is like generational change too, because a lot of the post-independence leaders, they were going through holy ways, right? They were educated in France. They had like this affinity to France too, but they're all dead now, right? And many of the people who remember them are dead. So, but I have a different question.
Yeah. But just on that real quick. So yeah, that's an interesting point. Having gone to Senegal not too long ago, I was there in January, and going to Gore Island, where you can see the original École William Ponty, which like this first generation of African leaders, a lot of them went to that, at least in French West Africa, Houphouët-Boigny and others. But yeah, there's been a shift. And then looking at the Sahel now, with if you look at those 3 states, Mali, Burkina, and Niger, right? president who was deposed in a coup, Boubacar Keïta, right? He did his training in France, right? I think he did a doctorate up there. And then you had Roch Kabore in Burkina Faso, who did his education in France. And then Bazoum, deposed in Niger, he did his training in Senegal, which is some people might consider French adjacent. And then the people that replaced them, right? They, maybe they've done some trainings, military trainings, but they're a newer generation. They speak more of the language of the youth, especially if you look at somebody like Traoré in Burkina Faso, right? A completely different generation, and doesn't have that strong connection to France through education or other ways. But your question?
Yeah, so my question was about China, because they're active all over the continent as well. I don't think you mentioned that. Like, are they playing a role in this, or are they just kind of enjoying watching France and Russia sort of go at it?
Yeah, there's probably some of that, but they do a lot with news stories, right? Media pieces that local newspapers or websites will pick up and put on their platforms, right? Just because it's kind of an easy way to have some journalism. And I think those pieces tend to elevate Chinese reputation, really talking about their investment in infrastructure, right? That gets them a lot of mileage. So I was telling Awa earlier, when I was in Senegal back in January, we went out to Touba, which is one of the holy cities in Senegal, and the Chinese built a 4-lane highway all the way to Touba, and people love that. So I think that they also invite a lot of journalists to China, where they go for trainings and things like that, and they come back to their countries of origin. And the U.S. does some of that stuff as well, but maybe not on as big a scale.
There is one question online.
Carolyn had one question. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Yeah, I just wonder, focused on sort of the false, news coming around on social media, but I mean, that's going to be the tip of the iceberg, right? Or sort of the outliers to some degree, maybe. But I mean, I guess the question you were pointing out, okay, as social media access increases, you get more sharing of these false news. But you're also getting, I wonder if there's a connection to how much you're getting more access to independent news sources and what's going through on, it's not false news, stories circulating about how France benefits from the CFA and stuff. And if you would be able to track sort of the content of the true news stories alongside what's happening on the false news, because it may be that, having more independent sources of news about what France is actually doing is part of what's feeding the negativism that then kind of gets either, reflected or cycled up through some things. That maybe just access to independent news more widely is part of what's undermining their support, not specifically the false news.
Yeah, it could be. I think it would be interesting to do like a randomized control test where they expose people to different stories to see how much it changes their perceptions, right? Like if it is just a truthful story about what France is doing or what some other country is doing, how much does that shift perceptions? Or is it more like these salacious stories, the ones that are rooted more in why we're experiencing terrorism, that really capture people's attention? And then also like the medium through which it is delivered to the people who are consuming it. Like, does a 500-page article have the same impact as something like this? Or a short video? Can a 5-minute video, which has some nuance and really digs into the storyline? Like, I think we face the same thing here in the United States, where you could watch something on PBS that might be really nuanced and give a really good take, a really deep dive on the issue, or you could just have that 20-second media piece that you can absorb really quickly and then swipe to something else. What do people like to consume? I think there was one question online.
No, I said it was just related to the previous one.
Okay.
About is the withdrawal and unpopularity of the French UN forces. What could be the way forward to reduce terrorism and maybe encourage democracy in Sahel? Do you think there is a role for the US government?
It's a heavy question. I don't think I'm set up to respond. Bring security to the Sahel. Well, I think the major news story is what's happened in Niger most recently, with the Nigerian government asking the U.S. military to leave. That's a real challenge, because I don't think Nigerians have maybe seen any commensurate increase in their security despite the presence of U.S. troops. Maybe that's playing some role, but I don't have any answers for delivering security to the South. Michael.
So I wanted to ask you, this related to a couple of different issues here. What is the role of the diaspora living in France? So a lot of people, the sort of the urban young people that will have family members who live in France, or who are attempting to migrate to France or have this more direct relationship. And a lot of them will be struggling. A lot of them will be struggling migrating. A lot of them will be struggling when they have arrived in France. And that's a quite different story than maybe the more positive story about elites being educated in the Sorbonne or top institutions in France. How does that shape the discourse about France at this point?
That's a really, really interesting question. Because on the one hand, as a migrant going to another country, and I remember I knew people in Niger who would say, oh, I have a cousin or uncle that lives in Paris. And when I was in Niger, I'd always think, oh, I think of like the Eiffel Tower and the most beautiful part of Paris. But they're living in the roughest parts of town, the banlieue. And, on the one hand, migrants, I think, sometimes want to portray like their best life on social media and how great they're doing and everything like that. But on the other hand, I could see how many people from French West Africa or North Africa going to Paris, or being descendants of people who have migrated previously, having a really difficult existence there. And that could actually play into this negative opinion in France as well. Yeah. But the diaspora, it's a really interesting question, especially in regards to disinformation. Looking at like the conflict in Ethiopia and how Ethiopian diaspora in the United States have played like both sides of the conflict and disseminated a lot of disinformation about who is being killed and who's guilty of doing the killing. I think that's an interesting case. Another one would be, there's a really interesting podcast about Gabon and Ali Bongo and the diaspora in the United States and in France, who really pushed a lot of disinformation stories about Bongo to try and get him out of power. So the diaspora is it's a really interesting avenue to explore. I don't know if that answers your question 100%.
Yeah, it would be interesting to have a survey to show to what extent having those family members in France either enhances your perception of France, or maybe.
Right, because if they're being subjected to racism by security forces in Paris, or they're working very menial jobs that really don't deliver much.
You get remittances to that recently kind of like France. I mean,
Right.
who knows? It could either way.
Yeah, sure.
So I have so you said you conflict in Burkina Faso. I actually studied other the angle of climate change. So I wonder if you see the relationship between farmers and herders that can explain the increase in the conflict. Do you see any like the tensions between
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if you look at perhaps, I guess we could take the case of Mali, right, where you have nomadic groups, pastoralists like the Fulani, right, who are always moving their cattle from different spots to different spots, looking for grazing areas. Sometimes they'll come into conflict with sedentary groups, whether it be Dogon or Bambara. And because the Fulani, they don't have as many representatives in the government, sometimes they don't get as fair of a trial if they come into conflict. So I think that's why the Fulani have been especially susceptible to recruitment by extremist groups. And if you look at the composition of many extremist groups in Burkina Faso, there's a lot of Fulani who are among the ranks. That doesn't mean all Fulani are extremists by any stretch of imagination, but you do see a high number of Fulani joining those groups. And I think some of it has to do with being able to protect themselves, arm themselves, and terrorists have leveraged that insecurity that Fulanis have experienced over time to, welcome them into their ranks. So I think you can see it in Mali, Burkina Faso to a certain extent, and then if you look at some of those border regions along like Burkina, Ghana, Togo, Benin, you have some of those. I mean, the Fulanis are being accused by some of those governments as being members of extremist groups. It's really sensitive because not all Fulanis are extremists, but it's wedged its way in there. I think that the extremist groups have been really clever in their recruitment because they tend to recruit people who have some kind of grievance against the state and feel that the state hasn't done anything. Carolyn? I know you weren't looking at your phone. Somebody whispered that to you. That's good. Yeah.
So if we don't have any, thank you very much for